A Separate Piece by John Knowles, or John Knowles. I don't know. I picked this book up a couple months ago because it is considered an American classic, one that I had not read. It's often assigned to students to read in school, although that was not the case with me, but I wanted to read it. I wanted to see what it was like, see what it was about, and I'm really glad that I did because this was a very good book. Now, I don't know that I would call this a great book. I don't know that it quite broke over into that upper echelon of quality that we would denote as great, but it was definitely a very solid book and one that rings with a certain truth, and that is where its success principally lies, I believe. So, what is A Separate Piece about? And just heads up right now, I'm going to spoil this entire story because that's the only way I can really critique it. You have been warned. A Separate Piece is set at a boys' boarding school called Devon in New England in the early 1940s during the midst of World War II. This is a reflection, I believe, of the author's own childhood, which was spent in a similar environment, I believe. And it concerns two youths, one named Gene Forrester and the other named Phineas. I don't even know if he had a last name in this book, but they are best buddies, despite being very different people. Gene is more quiet and sedate and kind of has a predilection for books and book learning and, kind of more of an intellectual personality, whereas Phineas is more robust and outgoing and energetic and gregarious than Gene. However, despite their differences, they are fast friends until Gene one day impulsively does something that ends up crippling Phineas. He causes him to fall from a tree which they had climbed and break his leg, which subsequently deprives him of the ability to ever participate in sports again, as well as the ability to enlist or be drafted into the army to fight in World War II. And so, over the course of this book, Gene has to wrestle with himself and come to terms with why he would do such a thing and what that says about him as a person. And this, as I said, is where the book's success principally lies. So, the writing in this book, to get the criticisms out of the way first, is where the book was the weakest, I believe. Considering that this book is, as I said at the beginning, considered an American classic, I was honestly kind of surprised at how awkward some of the sentences in this book were constructed. Now, it's nothing deal breaking. It's not, a death sentence, really. But there were more than one instance in this book where I was reading and a sentence just kind of jumped out at me as being odd. The things could have been worded a little bit better in this at numerous points, but again, it's nothing that just destroyed the experience. But I was kind of caught off guard with how occasionally clumsy some of the sentences could be. The diction in this is fairly low level, which is why I believe it's probably assigned to kids in school to read because the word choice here is fairly easy to grasp. Although there are some poetically phrased passages in this book, especially as you get closer to the end. And so it's not terrible, but I think the writing could have been just a little bit better. There were sentences that could have been constructed in a little bit better of a fashion. But the characters in this book also, there's really only two characters, and that is Gene and Phineas. And they're memorable, although we don't really know all that much about them, and that was kind of a detriment, I thought. Um, these boys live. The entirety of this story takes place in Devon, which is this boarding school in New England, and so there's no real interaction with the outside world too much. But still, there's a decided absence of background on these characters. We don't know, even Gene, who is the narrator, this book is told in first person. Even he never makes any reference to any family life or relatives or anything. So his entire background before the story commences is just kind of one big blank. And I don't guess that's necessarily a kiss of death, but it was kind of noticeable to me. I would have maybe liked a little bit more background on the characters. But such as it is, Gene is a relatively well realized character. It is his internal conflict and struggle which forms the bulk of what this book has to offer, which forms the actual story of the book. And it's pretty well done. And through Gene, John Knowles, or John Knowles, however you pronounce it, is able to get at some really valuable human truths about human nature and the human condition. And as I said, to reiterate, that is where the book's success lies. Now, another factor about this book that struck me is its predictability, and that's not necessarily a criticism, but I think it does merit touching upon. This book was really predictable. If you've read any kind of coming of age story, like Bridge to Terabithia, A Taste of Blackberries, On My Honor, etc., you kind of know what to expect. Two kids of very different character, nevertheless form a really solid friendship. They have some adventures and they have some good times, but then tragic shit happens and surviving kid gains maturity and perspective on life. There's kind of a formula to it, and this book was pretty formulaic from that perspective. At least I was able to predict where this was going pretty early in the book. I called it pretty quick. And what I called, as I said, I'm going to spoil it. So Gene impulsively does something that causes Phineas to break his leg, which derails his career in sports as well as possibly the military. And he has to wrestle with why he would do that to someone who is, for all intents and purposes, his best friend. But then at the end of the book, Phineas dies during surgery, and I called it. I was like, one of these kids is going to die, and since the book is told in first person, I know which one it's going to be, and it happened. But it worked. Although I think it could have got some more miles out of it. It was not quite as emotional as I think it could have been. And the last interaction that Gene and Finney have was not that poignant. I really think that John Knowles could have maybe put a little bit more emotion into their final encounter, because it was just it felt a little bit rushed. And then when the ending came, it wrapped up. When that denouement came, it kind of wrapped up fairly quickly after that. But let's talk about where the book's strengths lie, because the book's strengths lie in its thematic subtext and the truths which it is able to pinpoint about human nature. So the book does a really great job of juxtaposing and infusing both war and peace. The book is called A Separate Peace, but it takes place during wartime. And it does a great job of creating an atmosphere of innocence lost. The boys at Devon are experiencing, when the book opens, one last blissful summer of childhood carelessness. They they're having a good time. They're going to the beach and everything, but it's all they know in the back of their heads that very quickly, as soon as they graduate, they're probably going to have to go to war, and some of them won't be coming back. And so there's always this threat looming over the proceedings in the book of war and possible imminent death. And so it does a great job contrasting the world of childhood, which is innocence and naivete, with the world of adults, which is war and the loss of all innocence. But also, the book highlights the war that happens within people. So, the central event that shapes this story is when Gene impulsively hurts his best friend, and it's because he sees or thinks he sees something in Phineas that isn't really there. And this is the broader theme that the book is able to extract and really hold up to the light. And it really does ring true. And it makes a sort of pronouncements about the rest of human society and about the war that's going on in the background because of what it draws out of the conflict within Gene, the narrator. So early on in the book, even though Phineas and Gene are best friends, Gene thinks that Phineas is always trying to one up him, that he is that they're kind of in silent competition with each other, and that there's kind of a rivalry between them, even though that really isn't the case, as he comes to find out. He thinks that Phineas is trying to outperform him, show him up, but he realizes only later, only too late, that that is not the case, and that Phineas actually has a heart of gold, and he would never do that. But he ends up hurting him because of something he saw that wasn't there. And so what he realizes is that he hurt his best friend. He lashed out, not because of anything that resided within his friend, but because of what resided within himself, his own insecurities and his own weaknesses. And that is the meat of the book, and the thing that still rings true all these years later is that sometimes we lash out at people and hurt the ones that we care about, not because of anything wrong with them, but because of what's wrong with us. And that is where the book is a ringing success. And it's still just as valuable now as it was then, even though World War II is, an increasingly distant memory. This book still rings true because of what it says about humans and their propensity to harm each other, even though they have no real cause to. And this book was a success, as I said, but mainly in its thematic content and not so much in the writing, which was occasionally a little bit clumsy, I thought at least. And the characters, they're the narrator. I've said before that when you write a book in first person, you're kind of getting out. You kind of get a bye because you don't have to develop any of the characters except the narrator. And Gene is fairly well rendered because the bulk of the story is just his internal conflict, which is interesting to read about. But there's no backstory to any of these characters. We don't know anything about Gene really, and so I think there was more that John Knowles could have done to kind of flesh these characters out just a little bit more, because they are kind of blank slates a little bit, at least in their backstory or absence thereof. Also, this book, it had a really strong beginning, especially because it doesn't waste too much time. It's a pretty short book. It's barely like 200 pages. And it doesn't waste too much time getting to its inciting incident. But after that, it's kind of a snooze fest until the ending. And the ending, as I said, was pretty predictable if you are familiar with the tropes of this kind of story. You can kind of, see it coming. But the beginning was really good. The middle part dragged. The ending was pretty strong, even though it was predictable. But it's the kind of melancholic pronouncements that this book makes about humanity that still really has power today, that still have the power to really kind of evoke a certain emotion and a certain reaction in the reader. And it did with me too. And so I think this book is a success where it needed to be, in that it said something true about human nature. That is what all great books, I guess, try to do, is to say something true about human nature that will lend to the work a lasting relevance. And I think this book hit the nail on the head in that regard, even if the technical aspects of it maybe weren't that great. On Goodreads, I have noticed that this book has a remarkably low rating for a book that was nominated for the National Book Award, actually, the year it came out, and again is considered an American classic. I think it has like a 3.6 on Goodreads. That is not a very high rating. But looking at the negative reviews, it seems that the biggest criticism against this book is that it was boring as hell. And I can get that, especially if you were assigned to read this book in school. I could see why you might find this boring, because you have to kind of have a certain level of emotional maturity, I guess, to really understand what the book is trying to say and what the message is trying to convey. But if you can pick up on it, it's a really valuable lesson, and one that probably will never lose its relevance. One thing that I noticed, though, is that I was kind of expecting this book to go in kind of a more queer direction. Like, the potential was there. The potential was definitely there for this to be kind of have like a homoerotic overtone. but it never did. This is the first time I have ever read a book and been like, it queer baited me. It did. That was queer baiting. It's not that it had to be some kind of gay romance or anything. It didn't. But like you kind of expect, like with adolescent boys of this age that are of this level of like intimate friendship, you're like, it could go there. It could just kind of, some it could flirt with that territory, but this book never did, even though I have seen a lot of people kind of like trying to draw that out of it. Like, no, there was definitely something going on between them more than just friendship. But honestly, that isn't the case. John Knowles, whatever, even like said in an interview apparently that is not in the book at all, and I believe it. They really were just really good friends. So I mean, it's neither here nor there. I guess it just kind of defied my expectations a little bit because I was expecting it to kind of go in that direction, but it didn't. But whatever. It's still a good book. To rate a separate piece, I think I would give this a B minus. I think the writing could have been better in some places, at least. I think the characters could have had a little bit more, at least information given about them, because again, we know nothing about Gene or his history or really anybody in this book. But still, the meat of the book, the crux of the book, what the book has to offer the reader is still just as true now as it was when it was written, and just as valuable too. So I think this book, as I said, succeeds in the most important area, and that is what it has to offer. So yeah, B minus. A separate piece by John Knowles or John Knowles. Have you read a separate piece? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I have said about it here today. If you have not read a separate piece, I could really recommend it. I think it is a very solid book that is well worth reading, if only to kind of see the conclusions that the author is able to make about us as humans through the internal conflict of this boy in this story. Very valuable, very worth reading just for that alone. It's also a very breezy book. I read this in 2 days. I could have probably read it in one. It won't take up much of your time, but I think it leaves a mark. It leaves an impact, and it's a success, as I said. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to like, subscribe, help the channel out. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.